What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at the 12-game main slate for Sunday, October 2nd, here in Week 4 of the NFL. We only have 3 games in the late window this week. It's the Arizona Cardinals, the Carolina Panthers, New England Patriots visiting the Green Bay Packers, and the Denver Broncos visiting the Las Vegas Raiders. More on that game in a little bit. First and foremost, our favorite play this week is Detroit Lions running back Jamal Williams. You see him on the screen here. Jamal Williams will draw the start at running back for the Lions this week with DeAndre Swift inactive for the Lions in this matchup with the Seattle Seahawks. Jamal Williams is going to be about 30% owned on DraftKings, roughly 20% owned on FanDuel, and the most popular play on the Week 4 slate of games, so you probably want to build around him with your lineups this week. Now, the other places that we can go on this slate, you've been watching our show. If you're watching our show for the first time, welcome. We like to look at the betting markets and what they tell us about which running backs may have the best roles this week. We have 3 teams that are large favorites. The first being the Green Bay Packers, who are favored by 9.5 points against the Patriots. That's largely because the Patriots will be running a backup quarterback this week. Brian Hoyer will start with Mac Jones inactive with his ankle injury. So Green Bay getting a lot of love in betting markets. The combination of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon are in a really good spot to succeed here. It should be a positive game script for them. New England has the 4th worst ranked rush defense in the NFL right now. So this combination of Jones and Dillon may have some value in high-risk contests. Ownership at this point in the week is not super high on these guys because they are virtually splitting the work. I believe the slight edge in carries in the year thus far does belong to A.J. Dillon, and they're both virtually splitting the work in the passing game right now. So flip a coin here on which one you want, but I think actually A.J. Dillon is probably the slightly better play based on how they're being used to begin the season here with the Green Bay Packers. Other big favorite on this slate, the Philadelphia Eagles are 6.5-point favorites at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. The problem with this matchup, number one, Jalen Hurts himself at quarterback takes up a ton of the rushing action for the Philadelphia Eagles. Number 2, the Jacksonville Jaguars are the number 1 rush defense in the NFL right now. So this may actually be a tough day for Sanders and Hurts trying to run against the Jaguars. The Los Angeles Chargers are 5.5-point favorites in their matchup against the Houston Texans on the road this week. Austin Eckler does lead the Los Angeles Chargers in targets since week 2 without Keenan Allen available. Keenan Allen will not be playing once again here in week 4. So there actually may be some value in considering Austin Eckler in some high-risk contests this week. Once again, he's not someone that is being actually considered super highly, at least as far as projected ownership in our model is concerned. Our model has been updated this Saturday morning for all the latest news that we know about all of these teams. The number 2 running back as far as ownership is concerned, Khalil Herbert with the Chicago Bears. He's David Montgomery's backup, and in his matchup with the New York Giants, he ends up being the 2nd most popular play on DraftKings, at least as far as how we have that forecast for you right now. The Bears have the 2nd lowest implied team total on this slate in betting market, so this may not be the best spot. However, they do have the 9th best run blocking offensive line in the game right now, and the Giants, who they're matching up with, actually have the 5th worst rush defense in the NFL right now. So you could certainly save a ton of salary for the rest of your lineup by playing both Jamal Williams and Khalil Herbert backup running backs in your low-risk lineups this week. It's certainly something that it seems like the field is going to be considering. Now, with only 3 games here in the late window and no running backs that I think are very viable in low-risk contests this week in those games, we're probably going to end up flexing a 1 p.m. only player. I did mention Khalil Herbert. On the other side of that game, if we go back to our running back model, Saquon Barkley projects to be 19% on DraftKings this week, 23% on FanDuel. That makes him the most popular play over on FanDuel for you players over there. 3rd most popular here on DraftKings. I think he's the next most logical low-risk running back this week as the favorite against the Chicago Bears for the Giants this week. The other thing to keep in mind with that game in New York, as well as with some of the other games I've talked about in a minute when I talk about our game stacks, is that the remnants of Hurricane Ian are ravaging the East Coast this weekend, so we're going to have a lot of weather impacting the NFL games here in week 4. In low risk, I do think you'll see a lot of people play these 3 running backs. If they don't play Khalil Herbert, what they may do is play Josh Jacobs from the Las Vegas Raiders as a favorite here against the Denver Broncos for just $5,500. He may be the one that people play over Herbert to play another favorite running back in a good matchup. But this, I believe, is your low-risk core at running back this week. Leaves you over $30,000 to build the rest of your lineup on DraftKings. That's more than enough. We believe that you want to roster 3 high-value, high-upside running backs in low-risk contests every single week on DraftKings and FanDuel. What you're trying to do here is maximize the total number of touches from the players at this position in your lineup, and hopefully this correlates well with actual production in fantasy football. Now, in our model, some of the other opportunities that aren't necessarily as popular, we're going to sort by projected weighted opportunities, which is just projected touches that we have for them this week. Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Austin Eckler, who I already mentioned, Derrick Henry. These are some of the more expensive running backs on the slate this week. Going over to the wide receiver model this week, we have a couple of plays that are extremely cheap that are going to be very popular this week. Richie James with the New York Giants and Mac Hollins with the Las Vegas Raiders, each project to be over 15% owned on DraftKings. So when you go into building a lineup this week and you see that the field is most likely going to consider playing at least one, maybe 2 of those guys in their lineups, you'll see how much salary you have remaining, and it really does open things up quite a bit for you. We still have $5,500 here. We're probably going to play a cheap defense. I can tell you that the number 1 defense in our model right now is the Houston Texans, so we'll just use them for the sake of argument. $6,500 per player remaining. There's quite a bit of salary here, and it does allow us to pay up somewhere else. We could pay up at quarterback in low risk this week with a build like this. Josh Allen playing the Ravens on the road. Lamar Jackson hosting Josh Allen's Bills at home. Jalen Hurts facing the Jacksonville Jaguars at home. Each of these dual threat quarterbacks certainly makes sense in low risk lineups this week. All 3 of them playing in some of those weather games with high winds and rain due to the Hurricane Ian remnants that are ravaging the East Coast. So that may be something that scares you off of them. The other thing people will consider is Marcus Mariota at just $5,600 here on DraftKings at home in the Dome against the Cleveland Browns. He's got some rushing upside. He's fairly affordable. Now we've got $7,000 to fill the final 2 spots of a low-risk lineup. You could easily play someone like Mark Andrews, who's just the best player in football right now, apparently. And then another wide receiver here at the high end to fill out the rest of your lineup. Now, I think the preferred path here, honestly, is to actually find another spot to pay up. And I think I don't like Khalil Herbert, and I'm going to trust our model. Looking at how we have it ranked in the Occupy model, we have Derrick Henry number 1 right now at the running back position. He's the underdog side of that game against the Indianapolis Colts. So Jonathan Taylor probably makes a little bit more sense in low-risk contests. Colts are 4-point favorites against the Tennessee Titans this week at home. Let's put Jonathan Taylor here in this particular low-risk build. Leaves us $3,800 per player remaining. Now, this is where we have a good opportunity to discuss the underperforming wide receivers for week 4. We have 3 weeks worth of data, and that is something that we like to look at in terms of forecasting how players for the past 3 weeks should have performed at wide receiver or tight end based off of how they've been used in their offenses. There are a few players who have extremely underperformed their roles. One does fit right at $3,800 here on DraftKings this week. It's Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver George Pickens. Pickens is our 3rd highest underperforming wide receiver of the week. Behind New Orleans' Chris Olave, who's not on this slate, and Detroit's DJ Chark Jr., who's about $5,000. Pickens has, you can see here in his game logs, 12 targets on the year, but just 5 receptions. So you can eyeball that, and you already know that he's somewhat underperforming his role. But when we take a closer look at exactly how the Steelers have used him this year, Pickens has an average depth of target of about 17.6 yards. He has just under 230 air yards, and he has not scored a touchdown on the season. He has a 25% share of the Steelers' air yards on the year and only about a 13% target share. Pickens at a low price here in high-risk contests specifically at like 1% ownership in our model probably becomes a much better cheap wide receiver play in high-risk formats than these other 2 guys here I have for your low-risk build, Mac Hollins and Richie James Jr. Now to finish off this low-risk lineup, I'll go back to the underperformers after we do that. Probably can't play Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is a little too expensive, and I don't think running 3 cheap wide receivers makes a ton of sense in low-risk contests. So the other 2 tight ends that you should consider in low risk, Pat Freiermuth and TJ Hawkinson, both project to be over 10% owned. TJ Hawkinson has a much better matchup this week. The Seattle Seahawks are the second worst defense defending the tight end. So I think he makes sense in low risk if you're not going to be paying for Mark Andrews. Going back over to the Occupy model, Davante Adams, number one. I cannot afford him at $6,800. DJ Moore with the Panthers. Mike Williams with Keenan Allen out with the Chargers. Stephon Diggs with the Bills, although we got to watch the weather there. Deontay Johnson's going to be super popular this week. I do think we need one of Diggs, Johnson, Tyler Lockett, Davante Adams, or CeeDee Lamb in here with some of the cheap wide receivers based off of what the field is going to do this week. Now, in high-risk contests this week, I still think I want to start all of my lineups with Jamal Williams in his matchup with the Seattle Seahawks. We typically give you 3 game stacks in the Daily Plug at OccupyFantasy.com. We've only given you 2 this week. The Daily Plug is available over there for subscribers to read. Make sure you check it out. It is the Raiders and the Broncos popping for us a little bit, and the Bills at the Ravens. Now, the issue with finding another game this week is nothing just really pops out as having a really secure amount of upside. I do think the 2 spots you'll see the field gravitate to other than these 2 games, it's the Browns and the Atlanta Falcons, and probably the Seattle Seahawks and the Detroit Lions, just based off of projected ownership. Jamal Williams is going to be popular. TJ Hawkinson, who I just talked about, is going to be popular. Jared Goff has a really good matchup because the Seattle Seahawks are the second worst pass defense in the NFL on the young season, so people are probably going to gravitate towards playing some of these lineups. And we already know, just by looking at the model that I had up on the screen a moment ago, someone like Tyler Lockett is going to be a really popular wide receiver this week, so I can see these 3 ones happening here in people's lineups quite frequently. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to build a high-risk core around the Raiders and Broncos games, and since that's probably what you're going to see most people do this week, especially in the smaller field contests for high risk. So let's go with the Raiders side because Derek Carr is the favored quarterback here. Everyone who does this is going to play the wide receiver in this stack, and that's Davante Adams, who we project for the most targets on this slate to begin with. So that's certainly the best way to start building a Raiders-Broncos stack. The other wide receiver here is Mac Hollins. He almost certainly will not have as big of a day as he had last week with the 11 targets, 33 almost fantasy points, but regardless, still a little too cheap for his role without Hunter Renfrow out there at 4,200. Fits in the stack here. Now, for a bring back on the Denver Broncos side, there's a couple of different paths here I think you could go. Courtland Sutton has the best air yard target role in this offense for the Broncos, so I like him quite a bit. Our model is pretty high on Jerry Jeudy as the best wide receiver to use in this stack. The other thing to consider is Javonte Williams at running back. This is still a roughly 60-40 split at running back between Javonte and Melvin Gordon. However, Javonte has still dominated in the passing game with 4+ targets every single week, and we have the Broncos projected to be the underdog side today, which means this game here against Seattle, where Javonte saw 12 targets from Russell Wilson, we may see something closer to this, and that's awesome in PPR formats like here on DraftKings. So I think I'm going to lean towards playing Javonte Williams with my Derek Carr double stacks in high-risk lineups. What do we do with the rest of our wide receivers in our lineup? This is a spot where we're really need to dig deep and consider the underperforming wide receivers for week 4. Here's what we published in the Daily Plug at OccupyFantasy.com for underperforming wide receivers. DJ Chark is the number 1 underperforming wide receiver on this slate for us. Chark has 18 targets on the season so far for the Lions, just 7 receptions and 98 receiving yards, but he has 330 air yards. 35% share of the air yards from Jared Goff in this Lions offense. And on top of that this week, there's no Amon-Ra St. Brown available. Obviously, he's got a questionable tag this week, as does other starting wide receiver Josh Reynolds for the Lions. So we have to keep a close eye on how available Chark will be for us to play on Sunday, but he certainly stands out as one of the better high-risk plays at wide receiver that isn't going to catch a ton of ownership. We have him about 7% right now due to his role thus far on the year. The number 2 underperforming wide receiver in our model this week is Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver George Pickens. Already talked about him a little bit at the beginning of this video, so you know what to do there. Kyle Pitts at tight end with the Atlanta Falcons. We had him as one of our fringe underperformers last week before we were comfortable with the data. He's still right there, and Pitts, at least in the United States, still does not have a touchdown in a regular season NFL game. Pitts with 33% share of the air yards from Marcus Mariota in this offense and a 24% share of the targets. Over 250 air yards, still no touchdowns on the year. That's a quintessential underperformer. We got to like him in some high-risk builds this week for sure. Elijah Moore with the New York Jets gets his buddy Zach Wilson back under center at quarterback. Elijah Moore has 300 air yards on the season on his 21 targets. over 26% of team air yards, 15% target share. Looking at all these targets that he's had every single week, 5+, but can't get over 50 receiving yards. Have to hope that getting Zach Wilson back under center will mean Elijah Moore gets a breakout game here in week 4. Next on the list, we have Deontay Johnson, same game. Getting a ton of work, as always, 10+ targets every single week. Still hasn't scored this year. Johnson with just under 370 air yards on the season, a 32% target share for Mitchell Trubisky, a 40% share of Pittsburgh's team air yards. Outside of the most popular high-risk builds, which is what I've got for you here, a framework of the Raiders and the Broncos, right? Our model is pushing us towards considering the Steelers and the Jets players a lot more heavily in high-risk contests this week. We've got 3 wide receivers in total between the two teams underperforming their roles. It just gives us a lot more to think about in high-risk builds this week. I do like correlating here. Deontay Johnson's going to be pretty popular this week, but we're going to trust the data here. We're going to go with him. And then we're going to go with Elijah Moore for a nice little skinny stack correlation here at wide receiver. Now on defense, I tend to just go with what our model tells us. Our model likes the Houston Texans #1 against the Los Angeles Chargers this week. I'm probably going to try to play the Texans in most lineups that I have, but with pricing this week and some of the cheap running backs available, I do think we can find our way to playing the Green Bay Packers, who are the most expensive defense on this slate in their matchup against Brian Hoyer. Depends on the type of lineup you're building, of course, but I do think that makes a ton of sense. I'm going to put the Texans in here just for the sake of argument. We've got 5,800 to play a tight end. That's plenty to play anyone other than Mark Andrews. I think it's a pretty viable way to attack the slate this weekend. Keep an eye out for later today, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Brian and Moose will be breaking down all things in the model, and they'll take your questions live. We will also have a Q&A in our Discord channel for Discord subscribers tomorrow morning at halftime of the Vikings and the Saints game. Remember, this week we have the London game between the Vikings and the Saints. First thing in the morning, depending where you are, so get up and enjoy that one. Good luck this week. We're looking forward to week 4, and we're also looking forward to talking to you more in week 5 about the NFL.